Today's Bay Area Innovator is Matt Gonzalez, who served on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in the early 2000s. In 2003, he made a notable run for San Francisco mayor as a Green Party candidate, narrowly losing in a runoff election to Gavin Newsom.
People always assume that we don't like one another or have conflict, but when I see him, it's always very cordial. You know, we ran a spirited campaign against each other. We had very different views, and the voters chose who they wanted, and that's that.
He joins us today as the chief attorney for the San Francisco Public Defender's Office.
Some of the southern governors sending migrants in planes and buses to Martha's Vineyard and things like that. The Democrats have responded by saying, oh, this is performative. Yes, you're right, it is performative, but what is the solution? We're going to provide more financial support from the northern states to have to also bear some of the responsibility for this. But your answer can't simply be, it's performative, right? It's got to also be truthful about the impact that's happening.
This is Bay Area Innovators, and I'm your host, Steve Espas. Matt, welcome to our program.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Fantastic to have you here. So, you had an amazing career. You've been through so many different chapters in your career.
I've lost a lot of political contests, if that's what you mean.
Well, yeah, but still you had a lot of different chapters, and I kind of see a pattern in your career, be it the Board of Supervisors, be it the running, the 2008 and the mayor's election, and your current position as the chief attorney. You've kind of rooted for the underdog, or you helped the underdog, and yourself, you were the underdog in these elections sometimes, and sometimes you came extremely close. What's your motivation for public service and for helping the other underdog?
Well, you know, I got into politics a little bit accidentally. You know, I didn't wake up one day and say, oh, I want to be in politics. And it wasn't really a lifelong dream or anything like that. I think my path was similar to the path of many other people, which is they find themselves in a situation that they're frustrated with and they want to propose change. Oftentimes it might be planning commission is making a decision about your neighbor constructing something and you're opposed to it. Or maybe your children are in the school district and you don't like what the school board is doing. And those things kind of get you going and you decide, hey, I can do that. I can do a better job than the decision makers. My first race was in 1999. I actually ran for district attorney. I was a young public defender because I had conflict with the district attorney's office at the time. And so a little bit out of frustration, definitely had a lot of opinions that I thought, hey, this is a better way to do criminal justice work. And so I got into that race. It was the following year that because I had run, people in politics that I had made alliances with encouraged me to run for the Board of Supervisors. It was now going to be district elections, and I was elected in District 5 and served one term.
Tom Amiano played a role in your getting involved, right?
Tom was an early supporter, you know, certainly because of his credibility and notoriety that helped people take my candidacy seriously, yeah.
Let's talk a bit about the 2003 mayor election. I don't know how much chance you were supposed to have, but you came in extremely close. There was a runoff election, and you ran against Gavin Newsom, and it was, I think, 47 to 53%. But what's interesting is that he had these heavyweights supporting him, anywhere from Bill Clinton, Al Gore, you know, all the heavyweights in the Democratic Party, and he was still that close. Can you talk about that?
It was an interesting race because there were about 5 or 6, what I'm going to say are major candidates, people that held some kind of elective office, or the chief of police, the city treasurer, supervisors, former supervisors, that sort of thing. It was basically a contest for who would compete against Newsom in the traditional runoff. So there were a lot of candidates running, were in opposition to him. He got into the runoff with a high number of votes. He had over 40% of the vote.
But not enough, not the 50%.
Right, but I finished second with 19% of the vote. So that shows you there were votes really spread out widely. I wasn't very well known. I was in my first term in government. We had not really spent a lot of time trying to promote me as a candidate for the future. I made it into the runoff, but once you're in a runoff, it's a two-person race, and people start maybe paying a little more attention or looking closely. And I had a lot of people start realizing that, hey, maybe the things I was talking about made sense. It was a very different election than the mayoral election that's happening right now in San Francisco. When Newsom and I ran, there were a lot of points of disagreement, whether it was how we were going to do business taxes or planning issues or public safety. Today, I've listened to some of the mayoral forums. The candidates sound so similar that it's very hard to evaluate who's different. And the differences are mostly what their backgrounds are. If you're a Daniel Lurie and you haven't been in government, you promote that. You say, well, the others have failed, vote for me. If you're an Aaron Peskin, you can talk about, you know, all the things you've done while you were in government. He's been a supervisor, so he doesn't have the power that a mayor has, so he's not to blame for all the things that have happened in the past, and makes a strong case that, you know, many of the things that we don't like would be worse had he not been there. That sort of thing. You have each candidate trying to carve out their difference in experience, but it's not really difference on the issues.
Why do you think there is? Is it more of a common, unified decision or a way of thinking for the candidate?
You know, when you're looking at issues and you're a candidate, you've got an opponent, one of the best things you can do is think about an issue differently than your opponent, because then you're sharing with the electorate how you're going to govern and how you manage thought process. But I think a lot of the candidates right now are fearful of being the outlier on an issue and disregarded by the voters because they're not in step. I'll give you an example. I was surprised to learn that all the candidates support the Proposition 47 reform. It's going to be on the state ballot, Prop 36. One of the big arguments is that, oh, you know, by reducing the threshold between misdemeanor and felony theft, we've increased thefts. Not that we've increased them, but that there's been an explosion in this kind of activity. And I understand people are frustrated with the issue, but when you look at the data, you know, there's a long decline in crime in San Francisco from the 1980s, 1990s to today. You know, the crime rates in the 80s, I mean, today, you're probably looking at maybe 75% reduction in violent crime. There's probably 80% reduction in property crime. People don't believe it. Yeah. But all the policy groups that have taken FBI statistics and the statistics collected by municipalities will show that. So one of the issues is, well, why do people feel differently? Well, they feel differently because we're bombarded with imagery from public cameras making us feel that crime is out of control. The $400, moving it up to $950. Interestingly, 40 states have thresholds above $950. Texas has $2,500, South Carolina has $2,000. And when I started as a young lawyer, 1990, if you took that $400 and took inflation into account, you would, $1 back then is worth $2.40 now. So 400 would be $960. I know I threw out a lot, but my point is a good candidate would stand in front of that and say, no, 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 no. We may have crime issues and we want to keep working to make our community safer, but this is not the measure for it. Instead, everyone's like, oh my God, crime is on everybody's mind. There's no point in talking about the statistics, and I better support Proposition 47 repeal, or, you know, no one's going to take me serious.
It almost sounds like it's not really looking at the issue, but trying to see what would please the voters the most.
Well, You know, a politician has to process what are going to be the opportunities to try to sway public opinion. And all of them, I think, not all of them, but the ones that privately would probably tell you they have no intention of voting for Prop 47 reform, will tell you that they don't have enough money or energy or opportunity to stop the steamroller that the electorate believes in. So they say, I'm not getting in the way of this. But it would seem to me that what's the purpose of being in politics if you're not going to carve out positions and try to educate the electorate and at least share your ideas? If I'm wrong about my statistics or this or that, someone can point it out and we'll have a discussion about it.
Right. I'll ask you more about that later, but I want to talk about something that happened in 2001, something I was involved with. And this was, I was involved with a resolution at City Hall about asking San Francisco to condemn the persecution of this Falun Gong meditation practice that China is been exercising for many years. At the time, it just started. Now, 20 years later, or over 20 years later, there's a lot of resolutions, a lot of things happen. It seems like it's an easier task to be done. But at the time, it was much more difficult because the Chinese consulate was putting a lot of pressure and make things difficult. You were one of the 3 supervisors who voted yes on the resolution. And not only did you vote yes, but I remember right before the vote, you spoke why you would vote for it and why you would vote yes to support this unjust persecution. Tell us more about that. How did you feel at that time, and why did you do it?
Well, I don't remember the remarks that I made at that time, but sitting here, I do remember that it seemed quite obviously a matter of human rights. And I think folks that were urging a vote against it were trying to turn it into a litmus test on whether or not people supported everything a Falun Gong, founder had said, or everything that the practice entails, or all of these things. But that has nothing to do with the resolution, which was, it seemed very transparent that the Chinese government was involved in persecution. They were threatened by an organization that had become so popular so quickly. And even though it wasn't directly engaging in politics, I think the fear that the government had is that if it chose to get into politics, it would be a formidable opponent to the communist government. Now, I don't know if that's the way you see it, but that's kind of the way I was processing it. We were lobbied by members of the Chinese consulate in San Francisco. I remember Rose Pak lobbied very heavily. And I don't know that Rose Pak and some of the San Francisco officials that were urging a vote against it were doing it for anything other than wanting to keep good relations with the Chinese government. I don't think they were really making a case that the persecution wasn't happening. I think they were just saying pragmatically, let's not upset the Chinese government. And that's not really a good reason not to support a measure like that. I know many cities have passed resolutions like that. Some of them are, I would say, have been amended to maybe be a little more watered down in the criticism of the Chinese government, which at least still brings attention to the issue. I will just add that it's often the case that when people want to defeat a measure like that, they spend a lot of time saying the Board of Supervisors shouldn't be involved in foreign policy and things like that. But, if you stand back from it, our local money goes into foreign policy. Our tax dollars go into these things, and when money is spent a particular way, there's less of it for the municipality and the things that we want. Certainly if you engage in military conflict, you're taking people out of the community to go fight those wars. There's a lot of nexus between what's happening in a municipality in these larger issues. Plus, in San Francisco, we have quite a number of elected officials that were prominent on the national scene, including Nancy Pelosi, Dianne Feinstein at the time, of course, Kamala Harris now. And so it's not such a stretch for us to do some consideration for issues like that.
And I do remember now the other two supervisors were Tom Amiano and Chris Daly, who voted yes. Thank you for that explanation. Next, I'd like to ask you about the 2008 campaign that you ran with Ralph Nader. How did it start? How did you end up running for Vice President of the United States?
I knew Ralph Nader, always been a fan of his work as a consumer advocate and an attorney trying to make change. He is running for political office in a democracy. He holds views that are different than the other candidates. So he wants to run and try to get his views out there. He has a lot of views that he thinks are real common sense ideas that are being suppressed by the major two parties. When you get into a contest like that, you don't have any illusions that you're going to win the election, but you understand that you're participating in a process that's trying to draw attention to things that are important and that get people thinking about how things can be done differently, whether it's foreign policy with the war in Iraq, whether it's universal health care, whether it's about the really inappropriate influence that corporations have on lobbying Congress and things like that. And there is a reason why people are frustrated with government, and sometimes it's because these things that have been in place for a long time and are not fair, that nobody's questioning them and challenging them. There's a very strong tradition of third-party politics in this country. The ideas around the abolition of slavery originated in the Liberty Party. The right of women to vote certainly was a third-party doctrine. And these things eventually became the majority thought. Today, the way people talk about healthcare is very different than when Nader first ran for president, when he was out there talking about things like the need to have single-payer health care, et cetera.
Just 20 years before, you ran as an independent at the time. Just 20 years before, Ross Perot, of course, ran, and he got 19% of the vote, which was huge for a third-party candidate.
It's an interesting contest because he got 19% of the vote, and if you remember that election...
He dropped out.
Yeah, he dropped out and then got back in, which I think probably brought his numbers down.
Yes.
It's one of the things you see Robert Kennedy running up against now, which is they're not letting him in the debates. If you don't get in the debates, people aren't going to hear your ideas. And they create thresholds for what you need to do to get into a debate. Anytime Nader met a threshold, they changed the threshold to make it higher. So I remember, I think in 2008, very early on in the campaign, in the state of Michigan, he was polling over 10%. Things like that, very high numbers for a third-party candidate. But people forget, Obama and McCain were not leading their primaries until they got into the first debates. When I ran for mayor of San Francisco, the first polling had me at like 6% in the polls. I only grew from that because I was able to get into debates and people saw what I represented. Ross Perot, I think, probably was like Jesse Ventura when he ran for governor. Jesse told me, we had a conversation, and he said he got into the debates because each of the other candidates thought he would hurt their opponent. He got in with less than 10% of the vote, and after the debates, he ended up being the winner. I think we ought to change how, our democracy works, how these contests happen, and let the voters really get to see, the different possibilities. It would be great if there was a real opposition in the United States. There could be a real dialogue, for instance, about what's happening Israel and Gaza and the Palestinians. The level of discourse, even what is perceived to be dissent, is so small right now between, you've got the incumbents saying they think there should be a ceasefire, but we'll go ahead and continue to give military weapons, and the other side very upset with any talk of a ceasefire. There's space for more voices to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't continue to fund this military operation, or, you know, really take it further.
Speaking of that, please share with us some of your thoughts. You, as an independent, how would you bring the, you know, unfortunately there's a big divide in this country right now between the left and the right. How would you bring them together if you were in position to do so?
That's a big question. I think there's a lot of issues that it seems like the Democrats and Republicans have carved out their position and they're not really willing to move. I think immigration is one of those positions. You know, you take something like, I think Republicans probably are fearful that non-citizens are voting with greater frequency than they actually are. They are concerned about ballot security and having to show IDs and things like that. And I think the Democrats should be more open to some of these proposals. I think they should say, look, the evidence doesn't support non-citizen voting or, you know, a high degree of fraud, right? You're always going to have some. But ballot security, ID cards to vote, we can do that. If that's going to make everybody feel better about an election, let's do it. But let's make sure we also count ballots that are mailed on election day, regardless of when they arrive. Let's make sure that somebody without an ID is able to vote provisionally until we can sort out whether or not we can count their vote. You know, there's got to be a trade-off, but get the things you want. When Trump talks about building a border wall, it's become a very simplistic discussion around immigration. The real question isn't whether or not a nation can secure its borders. Of course, we should be allowed to do that. The question, though, is, should we be increasing the number of legal visas for people to come to the United States from Mexico? If employers need workers, farm workers in particular, and need them from Mexico, shouldn't we have a path to citizenship? What does that look like? Let's hammer those details out so that we actually make some progress. When you look at like some of the southern governors sending migrants in planes and buses to Martha's Vineyard and things like that, the Democrats have responded by saying, oh, this is performative, and it's a very ugly thing to do to these vulnerable people. And the answer to that is yes, you're right, it is performative, but what is the solution? What is the policy solution to the upset that they have, right? Because if you have that many immigrants in those southern states, it's going to be a burden on public resources. So the Democrats should be proposing, look, we understand we're having this impact in Texas and Florida and elsewhere. We're going to provide more financial support from the northern states to have to also bear some of the responsibility for this. But your answer can't simply be, it's performative, right? It's got to also be truthful about the impact that's happening. But I don't see the two sides doing very well communicating with one another right now. There's so much distrust. But it would be helpful that the sides don't just take an issue and assume it belongs to the other side. I mean, before Trump ever talked about a border wall, people like Hillary Clinton and others were voting for it, you know, when it was before the U.S. Senate. So, you know, how it became this right-wing issue, it really actually doesn't make a lot of sense.
You also mentioned before transparency, how that would enable more of a way to bring the two sides together.
Transparency is a complicated issue because, you know, I think when you're able to share reliable information, people should be talking about the data points and trying to figure out what is happening. So, for instance, earlier I said, you know, people can feel that there's an increase in crime, but if all the data points indicate that that's not true, or it might be an increase from last year, but not in a 5 or 10 year period, you should have to reevaluate how you feel about something, and maybe your anecdotal evidence doesn't hold up. On the other hand, Maybe the way the statistics are being gathered are wrong. So we have to be open to that possibility. But let's have a real reason for it rather than continuing to fight about something where there's no space for common ground because nobody knows what the data points are that are being discussed. What I found in government was that, I always did better if I didn't feel like I was trying to do something to accomplish a purpose that wasn't honest. So for me, there was never I'll vote for this because the people that I'm going to ask for money in the future want me to. Or if you came to me and said, Matt, I'll trade, I know this thing is important to you, I'll vote for your thing if you vote for my thing. I would say, no, just tell me about your thing. I like that, I'll vote for that. And then I'll say, let me tell you about my thing. And if they voted against it, that's okay. They have a right as the representatives of their own district to vote for or against something. I'm not entitled to your support for it. When you do that enough times and your colleagues see you do that, they will not dialogue with you the way they might be dialoguing with one another. And so then I had some votes. I had passed a measure that protected neighborhoods from chain stores, required advance notice and an opportunity for some neighborhoods to fight against a chain store.
In San Francisco.
Yeah. And it also was a measure that for the neighborhoods that wanted chain stores actually cut the red tape to bring them there faster. Newsom wanted to veto it because he thought it hurt business. And so he was trying to switch some of the votes that I had obtained in a very legitimate, honest way. And those supervisors told him, I cannot vote against Matt's thing. I cannot do it. I've already committed to it. And really what they were saying is, we're doing politics in a different way. I'm not just going to change my vote because he's voted for things that I support and matter to me on the merits. I'm not going to mistreat him, And so it's possible to change behaviors, even in politics.
I think that's extremely valuable quality for a politician to have. And I appreciate that explanation.
I'll tell you one other thing. A lot of times people come to you and they present an issue or a problem, and you want to say, hey, that sounds great, I'm going to support it. And politicians are encouraged to support things because they want to be one of the first ones to be on board something. But they may have not already heard from the other side. And so I really believe that all politicians should be prohibited from committing to something until they vote. The most you should be able to do is say, hey, I like what I'm hearing. I'm inclined to vote for it next week, but let me hear from the other side. And I'll get back to you if there are issues that come up. That way nobody feels like, oh, he double-crossed me or he lied to me, or, and it also allows a politician to be reminded that there is a process of due diligence before you commit to something, even if it sounds great. You may want to spend a little time looking at something, and that way you're not in those uncomfortable conversations where you're disappointing someone or not having the conversation, just voting a way that you promised somebody you were going to do the opposite,
That definitely goes with journalism as well. We always try to cover both sides. And it happened that we would interview someone and they would say, I'll tell you the story, but you cannot ask the other side their opinion. So then usually we drop it right there because we're not going to just report on one side.
Yeah, good example, yeah.
Do you think you would have stayed in politics if you won in 2004 the mayoral?
Would I have stayed in politics? I don't know.
I mean, obviously your opponent is governor now and he's, about to run for president.
I decided not to run for re-election because I am trained as a lawyer and I love being a lawyer, and I didn't want to forget how to be a lawyer. The idea I had of politics, which is people trying to get information and make good decisions, was very naive. It's a lot of people trying to make those calculations. If I vote for this, will so-and-so be on my team and things like that. And so it wasn't, I don't think I was particularly good at it, and I don't think it was something I wanted to be doing. Newsom and I, by the way, you know, people always assume that we're don't like one another or have conflict, but when I see him, it's always very cordial. You know, we ran a spirited campaign against each other. We had very different views, and the voters chose who they wanted, and that's that, you know. I'll give an example. You know, when Newsom and I ran, we got in a runoff, and the person that had finished third was Angela Alioto.
Mm-hmm.
And Angela was trying to decide who to endorse. And both sides were talking to her. And she'd been running very hard against Newsom, anti-Newsom. But now she wasn't in the runoff. So she called us up and said, I'm going to support Matt. I've been thinking about it a long time. I'm going to do it. And we set a press conference like the next day or 2 days later. And the next day, her son called to cancel. And then shortly thereafter, she announced her support of Newsom. And people were upset, and I said, hey, we're not entitled to her support. She changed her mind. It's not for us to, you know, that's okay. Like, you know, it's not the end of the world. It's one you know, it's okay. And she had been talking to me, saying that she wanted to be a co-mayor, and she wanted to be in charge of homelessness and all this. And I said, Angela, I can't put you in charge of homelessness, and you can't be a co-mayor with me. I'm happy to call you up occasionally, but I can't do that. And of course, she had a press conference with Newsom where he was announcing she would be leading his homeless measure and all this stuff. It was very funny.
Do you think that might have made a difference?
Not at all. Everything makes a difference. Yeah. But, you know, I wouldn't do it differently.
Right.
You know, yeah, those things are just funny, you know.
Yeah, that reminds me of a tech story when someone I know, a Romanian who was very successful in developing companies, was working on some software, DVD software, and was working with Microsoft. Microsoft was going to buy their solution.
Oh, yeah.
They're going to have a press conference the next day. Same thing with Bill Gates and him presenting this new development, right? And that morning, he got a phone call, said the press conference is canceled, and Microsoft, all this time they worked with another company. They had to. They wanted to make sure one of them is successful, right? But the last minute they switched to the other one, and this guy was out in the
yeah, you know.
Yeah.
Look, if you think about all the bad things that can happen in your life, and that's one of them, it's okay.
Exactly.
You're going to be just fine.
That's exactly right. I really.
If you wake up healthy, you're doing great.
Yes. I want to just shift gears and talk about art. My wife and I had probably one of our first dates visiting one of your art exhibits at City Hall in San Francisco. And that place wasn't just a place where we meet artists. It became a hub of influential people and these amazing artists who would promote their, show their paintings and then display them in your office. Tell us about it, how you got involved and what motivates you. It's such an amazing thing to have art around you when you do anything, for that matter.
You know, I think my motivation was to do something more than just pay lip service to the idea that we promote the arts. And it's a positive thing to give somebody an opportunity to exhibit their art and also to do it without, censorship or any financial mingling with the transactions. So artists would come, they would hang the work. If somebody wanted to buy it, they'd buy it directly from the artist. We did shows every month, and it was a positive way to promote the artist. They would typically give some kind of artist talk during the opening, and we welcomed anyone. So, there were no good guys and bad guys on the political scene. And I think it is important at times that whatever you think is the big battle, that it's us versus them, that there have to be places that are neutral, where the parties can start talking to one another, and maybe, having art as an excuse to come by and look at was a starting place to also have a dialogue with different people. And I know that a number of supervisors and city officials had conversations with whether it's Green Party members or Republicans or whatever it was, you know, that would never have happened otherwise. So I think it served its purpose.
Matt, appreciate your time. Any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us?
No, it's a pleasure. Pleasure to be here, and good luck with the program.
Thank you so much for your time and for your service as a supervisor and as a chief attorney for the office right now. Thank you.
Thank you.